Expedition 44 here with Matt and Ryan, and we have a special guest on our show today. We've been on a series on the church, and we started with Revelation, and we've had a couple side jaunts with that, and this is probably our favorite side jaunt of the year, so we're extremely excited about today. I'm going to turn it over to Matt to introduce our guest today.
Yeah, so we're very excited to have Dr. Scot McKnight on the podcast. A little bit about him from his bio that I took off the internet here is he's received a PhD from University of Nottingham. He's been a professor for nearly 4 decades. He teaches currently at Northern Seminary in Lisle, Illinois, not too far from us. We're in Wisconsin. Dr. McKnight is a world-renowned speaker, writer, equiper of the church, recognized authority on the historical Jesus, early Christianity, the New Testament. Love his blog, the Jesus Creed. Is a member of the Society of Biblical Literature, Society of New Testament Studies, and some of his amazing books that I've got right here. I've got a few there. We're going to be talking today about a church called Tov. Thanks for coming on, Dr. McKnight. Anything else you'd like to tell our audience about yourself?
No, that's good. Thank you, Matt and Ryan, for having me on. I'm glad to be with you and talk a little bit about Tov. It's consumed our life for the last 3 years. So
that's great. So some of our church staff has gone through reading the book at the church that I'm at in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin. We just absolutely love the concept of what you lay out there in a church called Tov. But for those who haven't read it, can you maybe talk a little bit about why you felt led to write this book and kind of like the story behind it?
Yeah, felt led is a little too spiritual. I got kind of hooked into this one. All right, here's what happened. We were at Willow Creek for 10 years, and my daughter and her husband were there for about 20 years. And I think we were there about 10 years. We enjoyed our time there. We had left when the story about Willow Creek broke open, about Bill Hybels. Now, I'm a professor at a seminary, and my students are in the church. Most of them are serving in a church. And they all had questions. They had expectations. They expected me to be able to talk about this stuff intelligently. Because we had been there for so long, we had some inner angles and some knowledge about some of the things that were going on. But my daughter started writing to me almost every day. She would ask questions about the Willow Creek story after it broke. And I just couldn't believe, and I didn't know much about this stuff at the time. I didn't have language for it anyway. I was really surprised at how Willow Creek responded. But immediately I said to her, everything is going to depend. Now, this is after we saw the Chicago Tribune article when it broke open. And that evening, very late, my daughter had come home from dinner and we talked. And I said to her, everything depends on how they respond immediately, because this is going to determine the direction that this church is going to go. I said, if they deny, it's going to go bad. If they affirm it, everything can be kind of restored. You'll be surprised if Bill will acknowledge these stories. Well, you probably know the story well enough. It seems like everybody else does, and you all are close enough to know about Willow Creek. Bill Hybels denied it. So then we began to hear little rumblings going on at Willow Creek, and and my daughter would pass them on. She'd hear things, and her friend said this, and her friend said this, and they appealed to Matthew 18. Dad, what is it? What do you think that means? So I just began to respond to her in emails, and I had been doing this for at least a month, maybe 6 weeks, and I happened to be at a speaking event on my way home, and I was in the Cincinnati, I think it was Cincinnati airport. And I just sat down with my computer and I just started writing. And I wrote for about half hour, 45 minutes, and put together all my thoughts. And, you know, when I finished, I thought, this is pretty good. This is kind of summarizing some of the stuff that's going on. And nobody's talking about this because nobody really was offering opinion. It was just stories.
Mm-hmm.
So not long after that, I noticed that Willow wasn't responding, and Laura was getting increasingly frustrated, and I was getting like, okay, all right. A publisher asked me for lunch, and I met with two editors, and we had a really good conversation. They wanted me to. They offered me a book to write on Willow Creek, and I said no. I'm not a church historian. I'm not a historian of evangelicalism. I do know a lot about it, but I would have to completely retrain my mind to be able to think about that stuff that way. And I said, Willow Creek's not going to give me access to the records that I would need in order to do a proper study here. So I said no. And, but I continued to respond to Laura and to other people, my students. And we went to Turkey and Greece and Italy with a group of about 30 or 40 students. And this was in June. And when we got back, I think the next day I wrote to my daughter and I said, what's going on with Willow Creek? And she said, nothing. It's just there. And I thought immediately, Willow Creek is trying to stonewall the victims and just trying to go silent and force them to go public. And it was very difficult. So I decided that it was that Willow, because they were just tried to give the traumatized victims, I didn't use the word trauma at the time, the silent treatment, I decided I would go public. And I wrote a blog post about it on my old blog. And you two may remember it.
Yeah, I do.
It went viral.
Mm-hmm.
And I heard within a couple of weeks that it just went straight through the hallways at Willow Creek. And for a couple of days that week, a lot of people, they said things like, everybody talks about your blog post all day long. Well, I don't think that's true, but it's an exaggeration, but hyperbole works. And I do think it made an impact. And then I think I wrote one or two more. And then the story from the New York Times about Pat Baranowski broke. And I think that broke Willow Creek's back. But we learned, and not at that time, but we learned within a few months that another story was circulating at Willow Creek. And that story is the one that actually broke the back of Willow Creek. Pat Baranowski's public story changed everybody's opinion. But there was another groomed victim, a groomed person in the story that that when the elders found out what was going on, when people like Vonda Dyer and Nancy Beach or Nancy Ortberg, whoever, when they found out that this was going on, they decided that they would go public. And that's what actually was breaking the story. And then this person evidently had the goods on some of the stuff, and Willow did everything they could to silence this victim, but eventually they didn't. So this is how we got into this. But here's the thing, Matt and Ryan. I am not a reporter. The stories had been told. Now, I do know one other story about it. It's in the book. But I'm a theologian. I teach it. I'm a New Testament professor. And I wanted to provide a redemptive message to this. What can we do? My goal would be, what can we do so this never happens again? Of course, I know that's not going to happen, you know. That's like saying after David, once someone told David's story, no adultery would ever take place for a king. Well, that's not going to happen. So I wanted to be a part of a solution that would help, especially young pastors, churches, and future pastors to map a life that would make them much more aware of what's going on so that these kinds of things don't happen again, or they happen less. So Laura and I began to think about this, and Laura actually, I should say it this way, Laura was actually bugging me to write a book, and I kept saying no. And I really would say, no, Laura, I am not going to write a book. I have other things to think about. I'm writing on the book of Revelation. So she, no, you got to do this. Well, two things happened. Number one, in one of those early blog posts, and it may have been the first one, but it was early, I used the word goodness, that we need more goodness in churches. And the number of people who wrote to me about that, I thought, wow, this is interesting. Well, how do you talk about goodness? I mean, who disagrees with goodness? Everybody likes goodness. So I started to work on the word goodness in the Bible. And at that time, I thought, this little Hebrew word tov is kind of catchy. So I began to use it in my classes. And I noticed that the students just started using tov for everything. The Cubs had a tov game. I got a tov grade on my paper. Let us out early. That would be really tov. That was a tov lunch. And they were using tov for, I thought, well, this is catchy. So I decided that I would try to work on the theme of goodness. And I have a section in the book on what the Bible means by tov. God is tov. Everything he does and creates is tov. It's these kinds of themes that we're called to be tov. We're not tov, but God can make us tov through the Spirit. Jesus said tov when he said, well done, is usually translated in the English translations. It meant he used the word tov. So I worked on that. And then what we did, and this may interest you, is we came up with 7 characteristics of tov for a church culture. But here's how we came up with it. Laura and I mapped. We always have disagreements about this, is that she claims that she did something and I claim that I did it. So I'll just say that we mapped, but I probably did most of it. We mapped the characteristics of toxic churches. Okay. And then we flipped it to find out what a Tov church would do instead. So those, we call it the circle of Tov. In the circle of Tov, those 7 characteristics are not the same as the 7 or the definition of Tov. They are alternatives, oppositions to what happens in toxic church cultures. Okay. All right. Now I've talked a long time, but I got one more story to tell here.
Yeah.
At this time, I was thinking about this, and I was starting to teach it in classes, but I wasn't telling Laura about this. I read a book on German church pastors and how they responded to the Holocaust, to World War II, and how the church responded to Hitler, etc. Called Churches Under Hitler by a guy named, by a professor, I think he was at Middlebury, he might still be there, called Churches Under Hitler or something like this. Church Divided. But I was stunned as I read that book at the number of things the German pastors did to deny complicity in the Holocaust experience and reality, and to deny the corruption that occurred in the German church called the Deutsche Christen, and how complicit it became in National Socialism, what we call Nazis. And I started taking notes, and I thought, holy mackerel, this is the same thing that Willow was doing. It was the same kind of false narratives being told. And I began to notice it in other churches, and it almost became predictable when you heard a story about some pastor, there's plenty of them. You can guess what the church is going to do if it responds negatively out of toxicity. And we were together at Christmas, Laura and her husband and Chris and I said to Laura, I think I have an idea for a book. And man, did she get excited. But I said, it's negative, but it certainly sets up the problem. And the problem is false, and we called it's a chapter called False Narratives. And that's where the book actually began. But then we had to package Tov around it. And we had a really fine editor who did something to the book. The book was sort of, let's say, 7 core chapters, plus the false narratives and an introduction, with toxicity and Tov. It was sort of a back and forth between toxicity and Tov in every chapter. And he pushed the toxicity to the front of the book more, with the Tov pushed toward the back of the book. So the book got a redemptive feel. And I think it really helped the book. He suggested these things, and he worked out, he kind of rearranged some things, and then we had to edit it. So there you go. That's how we got into this topic.
I think that's great. And, I'm with you on the catchiness of the word Tov. I do Hebrew word studies with my kids all the time. And when you started kind of getting a little more open about where this book was going, I think that was like late 1920, somewhere in there. Like, I shared that word study with my boys, and for the next year, that was like their word. They were using it all the time. Every sentence had the word in it for the longest time. So there's your impact, not only on our listeners, but also on my direct children that I've enjoyed for the last several years now. And they still use it regularly, so that's been fun.
That's good.
I also found it interesting that Matt and I are kind of always talking about backward culture, backward kingdom type of things. And you wrote another great book, Pastor Paul, Nurturing a Culture of Christoformity in the Church, in which that word has kind of become a very communal word and amongst theologians now. And we're both involved at a seminary as well. And I thought it was interesting how you kind of finished with that, the nurture Christ-likeness, the leader culture words, which I think, you easily could have started with that or finished with it, but I thought that was significant of how you crafted it into it in that way.
Well, Christoformity came, I think I first saw it in my teacher, James D.G. Dunn. He was my doctoral professor. I think I first saw it in something he had written, and it just kind of laid on my desk, I guess you could say. But Michael Gorman has been writing about cruciformity for 30 years, and I really resonate with what Michael Gorman has said. But there was something for me that was a little bit lacking, but not in Michael Gorman's term. But not in his theology. His theology brings in the whole picture. And when I saw Jimmy Dunn's Christoformity, I thought, that's the word. That's the word that we need. I think it broadens our sense of cruciformity. Cruciformity tends to be a cross-centered life, but Christoformity is a Christ-centered life. And I like that a little bit better. It's not just the cross, it's the life of Jesus, the teachings of Jesus, the cross of Jesus, and the resurrection of Jesus, and the glory. All of that is a part of what it means for the Christian to be conformed to Christ.
And you described this as kind of a circle, and I would say I would start there where you kind of end there, and that was my point, but it all connects. And I think I'd love for you to just kind of expound a little bit on a few parts of this circle of Tov.
Yeah. Well, Ryan, it's a fair point. To me, Christ-likeness is the summary of it all.
Yeah.
It's the summary term. I mean, it could have started there, but then it would have had no plot, eh? No conclusion.
Yeah.
We'd have just finished with the last filling up of the gas. But we looked at various elements that countered toxicity. This is a question I'm asked. Laura gets asked this. We get this asked all the time. what are the marks of a toxic church culture? So our editor actually wanted, when he was working with it, what do you think are the two most important marks? And I said, well, it's obvious. We start there. It is a narcissistic personality that dominates the culture. And of course, that's an easy term to flip around, and it's a difficult term to understand because it has so many implications when that personality becomes dominant enough to shape the culture of a church or an organization. And believe me, many, many businesses are shaped by narcissistic cultures. And you could say capitalism is a narcissistic shaped culture. I mean, Adam Smith even would say that, sort of do what's best for you, and it'll be what's best for you is best for everybody. So we started with narcissism, and then power, the misuse of power, and in particular, how fear is used to prop up power. So we went with empathy. The opposite of a narcissist is someone who's empathic. Now, I don't know if you guys know this. There's a guy at John Piper's old school, or his school, who is one of the leading people who is against empathy. And I just find that impossible. I find, how can you be against empathy? Right. Empathy is something good. Well, in my opinion, they've misdefined it so they can dismiss it. Empathy is the opposite of a narcissist. To me, people who are against empathy are probably narcissistic because they have an incapacity to relate to other people and understand other people and Amen. To sympathize with their difficulties. And they got into some crazy definitions there. And then grace. Grace is an easy word to use, but John Barclay's book, Paul and Gift, and then his shorter book that puts it together in more accessible ways and shorter ways, really is an important study. And instead of power through fear, a Tov church culture not only is empathic or empathetic, it is also filled with grace, which means it understands people where they are, and it helps them along and helps them grow. And then a Tov culture has people first rather than an institution first. And so we came up with this category of institution creep, where more and more the institution matters more than the people who are in that church. So it's no longer, let's just use Willow Creek because we talk about it in the book. It's no longer about so-and-so who goes to the church. It's about Willow Creek. And when the institution matters more than the people, you have problems. And I'm not saying that that's always the case with Willow, or always was the case, or is the case in any individual situation. But you will find institution creep in a lot of churches that think that when the pressure comes on, they think, how can we preserve this church and my position rather than that person who's been wounded? And then we believe in telling the truth instead of propagating these false narratives. So that's the chapter where the book got its start. And we discovered that toxic churches, toxic institutions value loyalty. I cannot tell you two guys the number of people who have struggled in churches in the last 2 years who've contacted Laura and me, who have used the word loyalty like it is the most important value in that church. Loyalty to the pastor, to the leader. Yep. Loyalty should be seen as a good word, but loyalty is weaponized in powerful, toxic cultures to where it silences people from telling the truth. It abuses, it brutalizes people in the church. So we really looked at loyalty, and we discovered that the counter to the loyalty culture is justice. And justice, of course, that can mean anything for many people.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, justice, I often tell my students, because I work from the Hebrew word tzedek on this, justice means doing the right thing at the right time. And that's different than, let's just say, whatever your political persuasion is, justice gets defined by that, and justice doesn't mean conformity to the U.S. Constitution for a Christian. It means conformity to Jesus. So Christoformity is justice. And then we noticed that there was a celebrity culture, resist the celebrity culture. Well, now Caitlin Beatty has a whole book on this, on celebrity pastors. And we're going to be interviewing her on our podcast this Thursday, so in 2 days. Awesome. And we noticed that celebrity cultures make everything about, let's just say, the pastor and that platform on which his persona performs, so that you only meet the persona that pastor wants to propagate from that platform in his sermons and preaching. And I got to find some more P's, but I can't find them. And we found that the opposite of that was to develop a service culture where, instead of the pastor being the glory hound and the status seeker, the pastor too becomes a model and an example of serving others. So we worked on that one. And then the leader culture, this is one that I have a pet peeve about. And some people just think I'm totally nuts. And I don't care what they think. I find I'm old enough to remember when pastors started to be called leaders. Prior to that, they were pastors and preachers and priests. And then all of a sudden, they started to talk about leadership. And then I began to observe, and I mean, I wasn't the one who saw this first, for sure, is that the leadership models that were being used were coming out of the business world. And there is much to learn from that. But when pastors become leaders, they almost always lose being pastors. A pastor leads, but not all leaders are pastors. And when the model is Walsh or Welch or whatever his name is, what's the guy in Nashville who runs all the money, Dave Ramsey. When the model of leadership is that, you're not getting Jesus as the shepherd. Mm-hmm. You're not getting Paul as a pastor. You're getting a business model that runs things on the basis of bottom line and profits. And so we pushed against the leadership model, and we discovered we think that the opposite is Christoformity. And in that case, then it would be Jesus the shepherd, Jesus the pastor, Paul the pastor, etc. And I've written about that. So those are the characteristics of a Tov community, because they are the counters to the toxicity of narcissism, power through fear, institution creep, false narratives, loyalty culture, celebrity culture, and a leadership culture.
That's great. Yeah, thanks for sharing all that. I thought it was funny. You told a story about when some I don't know, editor or something asked you to write a post or a book or something about church leadership, and you said that you were more interested in followers. And I always loved that quote. I think it might be in the book, or I might have heard it on your podcast. But
I wrote something about this. I have no idea where I wrote it. It's out there on the internet on some probably now defunct website. And I think it was called the followership model or something like that. So I said, I'm not interested. I said, okay, I'll write about leaders, but it's going to be I'll write about leadership, but I'll call it followership. And I think that's, Paul says in 1 Corinthians 11:1, imitate me as I follow Christ. There you go. That's what
There it
true
is.
Christian leadership is.
That's great. Yeah. So if you were to give like any message to the church today, like what would it be? What's the big thing that you'd want the church to hear?
Matt, this is a really great question. And my daughter and I have written another book. It's called Tov Unleashed, we think, but they're playing with the title. We had to fight for the word Tov in the title.
Yeah, I remember.
They did not like that. But right now it's Tov Unleashed, but I have a feeling that title is going to change. If I had to say one thing, I would, and you could make this another toxicity and Tov characteristic, let's say in the circle of Tov. I would replace success with character. Our churches are measured by numbers. Steve Carter, who was at Willow Creek and played a very important role in breaking some of the false narratives down, said, he calls it the 3 B's: butts in the pew, bills in the plate, and baptisms in the water. And then I added, and buildings on the campus. That's how we measure success. But we've become a success-oriented church culture. And success is measured, it's quantified by numbers. I don't think that's healthy at all. We need to shift the church from a success model to a character model. And in other words, have you guys read Marilyn Robinson's Gilead? The little, her first novel?
No.
Oh, these 2 old pastors in Gilead, Iowa. This is a fiction. In fact, I got tricked into this. I thought this was a nonfiction book, and I was reading it. I thought, these 2 pastors are cool. I'd like to meet them. And about 40 pages in, the guy who told me to read the book told me, this is a novel. I said, I didn't even know it was a novel. I said, I actually put it down. I thought, they fooled me. But it's a great book about 2 pastors in Gilead, Iowa. And you can tell there's a relaxed feeling that they are taking care of the people in their churches. And that's what success was for them. They didn't even look at it as success. Their calling was to care for the people in their church. Now, the book is about other things. It's about this old pastor's testament. He writes this out, clarified to his very young son what his life was like, just in case he dies. He wants him to know what his dad was like. I think that is the message I would give to the church, is we need to completely shift from a success model driven by numbers to a character model driven by growth in Christoformity.
Mm-hmm. Amen.
And I think that this is not a change or a shift. It is a revolutionary transformation of what church is and what pastoring is. And I think you would discover there's a lot of people in the church that don't want that. And a friend of mine, no, I shouldn't say, a former student of mine, 2 former students of mine, I believe, wrote a book, Mike Lucan and Kent Carlson, and I think it's called Renovation of the Church or something like that. It's a story about their church in California. And in that church, they shifted from a model of a Willow Creek model, and they're not critical of Willow Creek. They learned it from Willow Creek, and they became rising examples of the Willow Creek model. They became convinced of the Dallas Willard model of transformation. And they looked at their church and said, we're not doing this at all. So they shifted their church from a seeker-sensitive type approach to a transformation model. And I think they lost about 40%, 30% of the congregation. But it's a much healthier church in a church sense today than it was at that time. So I think that's what I would say. Let's start focusing on character.
Yeah, that's great. We've been going through the 7 churches in Revelation. We just did the Church of Sardis, recorded an episode on that the other day, and talked about the church that looked alive but was actually dead. It just plays so much into that. When you talk about fruit, we sometimes think of fruit just as good deeds done, rather than like the character of Christ being built into us that overflows into that.
Yeah. We were just in Sardis.
Yeah.
It's not much there now.
No.
It's just a ruined field of ruins. But the students like to go there.
Did you climb the cliffs? Was there any red in the dirt or anything like that?
I don't know what you're talking about there. I mean, there's nothing.
Nothing there.
There's red clay bricks, but I think they're from the 2nd or 3rd century AD. But the churches in the book of Revelation, chapters 2 to 3, Babylon is beginning to creep into these churches. And so, and that's what I've written. I have a book coming out next spring called Revelation for the Rest of Us. And
nice.
I wrote it with a student, Cody Matchett, who's going to do a PhD. Babylon is creeping into churches, and that's what we begin to see in Revelation, is the way of Rome is not the way of Christ.
Yeah, we talk a lot about that on our podcast and website and everything else. It's a kind of, I'd say, one of our central themes is looking at, that message then and then also still now.
Yeah, very good. Very good.
Well, Scott, thank you so much for coming on, for joining us, for imparting your wisdom and what you've studied to us and our audience. Before we close, is there anything else you'd like to say? Is there anything you'd like to plug? Have people connect with you, follow you?
I'd rather people follow me because they like what I have to say rather than advertising what I'm doing. I have a translation coming out on the New Testament. Who knows when it will come out? I think it's a lot of work for the editors at InterVarsity. It's called the Second Testament. It's all done, and the old translation's in. It's all been edited, so we're going to get ready to send it to the typesetters. I got to do a glossary, and we got to make sure the maps are right and all that stuff. And I have this book on Revelation coming out, and I'm working on this project for Zondervan that is it's climactic for me in my career as a New Testament professor. It's called the Everyday Bible Study. It's sort of like a mini daily reflections on Scripture, but it's like a mini commentary as well. And that's occupying the majority of my time these days, is working on that. I just sent the Gospel of Luke to the person, Becky, who writes the questions. And in 2 weeks, I begin the book of Romans.
Wow.
So I'll start writing this little study guide on the book of Romans. So
awesome. Yeah, well, thank you so much again for coming on. I know, speaking personally, your books and your writing have blessed me immensely and have really helped in my Christoformity and my learning and becoming more conformed to the image of Christ. You should all go check out Dr. McKnight. He's got a podcast, Kingdom Roots, I believe it's called, right?
Yes.
And your Jesus Creed blog also. And again,
a Substack newsletter called Tov Unleashed. Yeah.
There you go. Yeah. Well, thank you for coming on. We just pray that God would take this message of Tov into our churches, and that we create cultures of goodness throughout the world. Yeah. So God bless you and keep you.
Thank you. You too. Thank you very much.